Well, we'll see, shall we? Oh my god! No, no, no!
Hello and welcome to a slightly different video today. It's going to be a little VFX breakdown of our most recent sketch, the Superpower giveaway, which if you haven't seen, I'm not entirely sure how you've ended up on this video, but if you have somehow stumbled across this, make sure you go and watch your sketch, otherwise most of this won't make sense. You know, it's quite a good sketch, if I do say so myself. It's at least okay, and it's worth a watch. So yeah, go check that out, and if you have already seen it, well then, great. Let's get on with it, shall we? So this isn't going to be a tutorial of any kind. I'm no expert, I'm no VFX artist, but I do dabble occasionally. And we thought you might be interested to see some of the befores and afters and how we achieved these effects with pretty much no budget and, to be honest, quite limited know-how. So there are quite a few different effects in this, and one of the main ones is, of course, the teleport effect. Kris is zipping about all over the place, happens quite a few times. Most of them are pretty similar to each other. There's a couple which have a few aspects which make them slightly trickier than others, but the basic effect kind of worked like this. We started with Kris doing some superb acting of being pulled into the void. Superb. There, well done, Kris. Then we filmed a plate, which is basically the exact same shot, but without Kris in it. So then we can combine those two together and his acting, and he just disappears. Doesn't really look like he's teleporting though, it's just a hard cut, but you know, we're getting there. We then wanted to cut Kris out, had to do that frame by frame, which is obviously a bit time consuming. This is probably one of the most time consuming bits of this. Then we have Kris doing some, looks like a chicken impression. And then what we did with that is we would shrink him down. But as you can see, his legs are disappearing. Where's his legs gone? Obviously, they don't exist because they weren't filmed. So we did this sort of cheap and dirty thing to fix with this. We basically just reversed the image upside down, as you can see on top of there. Flipped it upside down and then just stretched it out. Now, obviously, that doesn't even begin to look like his legs, but there's going to be so many other effects that are added on top of this, lights and blurs and everything. You're not even going to be able to see it. This stage is almost kind of unnecessary, but it's just so we didn't have that hard line of his legs being cut off. We then, once we have him cut out, we're going to add a load of effects to him. So we're going to add a blur and some glow and some turbulent display, so it looks like he gets sucked into nothingness as opposed to just shrinks down. Looks like he more dissipates. And then we can composite that onto the background we created before. Next, we added this sort of energy light thing, squiggly line stuff. So we used this same mask we used to cut him out. And you can see we just created this sort of glowing energy light thing using the Saber plugin from Video Copilot. It's free. So if you're into doing this sort of stuff, get it. And then we added sort of like a shine effect, so it looks more like he's exploding into nothingness. So then we can composite all of that together into seeing him both shrink down and have this glow beside him. Then with the background, we're going to add some light and this sort of warp effect, as if it's like pulling space and time around it itself as he gets sucked into the void. We can then composite all of that together, so then we have him twist and turn into nothingness as the world warps around him. And that's pretty much the final effect. Finally, we added these sort of squiggly energy bits. I don't really know what to call them. It's basically from a shockwave pack I have, just to add more like he's being disintegrated into nothingness as opposed to just simply shrinking. Then when you combine that all together, you end up with the final effect. For the effects where he teleports back in, we basically did the same effect with certain bits reversed. So we have this. I actually kind of prefer how it looks when he disappears to when he comes back in, but this is kind of the best I could get it. So we start by having those shockwave sort of things we used at the end of the effect last time, almost as a precursor to him arriving. And we also have the warp effect on the background begin earlier, almost as if it's beginning to pull time in as again, a precursor to him actually then coming in. And then all of the rest is pretty similar. We had this sort of glow and this distortion effect to him with that energy on the outside, and he comes back in. So some of the things that made the other shots slightly more challenging was having the book thrown at him. This was pretty simple, actually. We basically took this separate shot of me throwing a book in. We then cut the book out pretty badly, and look at that shadow there. It's awful. Looking back at that, I probably should have done a better of a job, but it works without, so turns out I didn't have to do a better job. And then obviously when we composite that into the final effect, it just goes through the distortedness. Hits the wall, and looks like we threw a book at him and he missed it. Well done, Kris. Well done. So for the shot where he teleports outside, this is pretty much exactly the same, but obviously you can see there's stuff in front of him which obscures some of the effect. So you can see the flare goes over everything, but we have the rest of sort of like the distortion and stuff happen behind this frame, which is very simple. We basically just cut the frame out separately and put that on top of everything, which now means he could be anywhere. On a side note, when he's cut out like this on his own, he kind of looks like he's really heavily moshing. This one of him coming back in from being in the sea, I think was what we were trying to get across, was probably one of the more involved ones. There are two things that made this slightly different. Obviously, we have all the water effects, which are on their own just look like that, just from a little water pack I had. Nothing exciting. And surprisingly, despite him actually being in this shot completely drenched, he doesn't look that wet. He just almost kind of look sweaty. Well, obviously spits water out, which helps sell it. But he doesn't actually look that wet. So I think adding these water things helps sell the fact that he was meant to be under the sea. And then the other thing, which made it slightly tricky, is that we didn't realise at the time of shooting, obviously he can be seen in the mirror. So we had to basically do the effect twice. It's the exact same effect, but we just had to cut him out in the mirror as well, and also have him come in, which made that slightly more annoying. And the final time we did this, we had obviously two of us in the shot, which makes things slightly more complicated, and obviously we interact with each other as well. So how did we possibly achieve it? Where was he before? Did he actually teleport in? No, obviously he didn't. So the original shot is just this. Kris is actually sitting there. He waits. He does his amazing acting of coming back into shot and hands me the tea. We then recorded a separate shot of me sitting down without Kris there, because when I then sit down in the final one, you can see that the sofa on the left-hand side also has to move, but Kris is obviously sitting there. So we used half of this instead and just timed it to the same time of me sitting down, and then added the same effect in of Kris coming in, and then he can hand me the tea. Easy. The stuff with Kris being frozen was relatively simple. Kris wasn't able to act like super still, as can be seen in this example. Mate, that's really hot. Kris? What are you moving for? You're meant to be paused in time, my friend.
I was holding my tea pad.
So we needed a bit of help from some VFX. So in this shot, we basically just cut Kris out separately and added a frame hold on him. Then obviously, when I interact with him, oh no, my hand goes behind him. That's unfortunate. So then we had to cut the hand out to go over the top, which obviously you can see quite a lot of him. But luckily, because he was pretty good at staying still, fair play to him, you can see that underneath him, he was pretty much in the same position. Because I basically used the frame hold as close to my hand being over his face as possible. But we needed to have a lot more of my hand being used because, as you can see, there's a bit of shadow cast onto his face and body, which looked weird if we just cut my hand out instead. There are some other bits, like when I begin to get up, you can see the shadow on the left arm there. Not sure you would have noticed without it, but it just helps sell the effect a bit more. The poke effect was slightly more involved, because obviously I interact with him a bit more directly. So obviously we just sort of roughly cut Kris out. We then had a plate shot, obviously without anyone in it, which we just took part of, put Kris back on the top, put me there, and then as my hand then comes over the top, obviously it gets lost. So we had to cut my hand out and then put that behind Kris, because obviously Kris's face is actually there. And then when I poke him, it's simply a case of puppeting his face back a little bit. It doesn't look particularly realistic. It looks very much like he's being puppeted, but it just helps show there's some interaction with the object. And of course, we also had to add some shadow onto his face. You can see it just slightly darkens there as I get up and come over him. I think you can tell it's fake once you know, but it just helps sell the effect a bit more because in real life, when I actually did it, quite a lot of shadow was cast onto his face. We know that there's quite a lot of light coming in from that right-hand side. So if I step in front of him, I'm obviously going to cast a lot of shadow, and then as I leave, the shadow also kind of leaves. So this remote one was one that looks very simple, but actually ended up being a bit more of a nightmare than we wanted it to be. Mainly because when I dropped the remote, I wasn't kind of aware that from the angle of the camera, it drops directly over my arm. This is obviously the original effect. I drop it and just continue to stare where it should have been. But obviously we have to get rid of this remote but it covers my arm the entire way down. So I had to basically go through and frame by frame recreate my arm and the wall behind it through previous other frames, just recreating my arm to cover the fact that when the remote does drop, the remote effectively then disappears. So obviously the remote is originally there, and then we have to take it out, and then we added just the remote frozen in time afterwards. For the remote being held, we added this sort of bit of delay to it being frozen, because without it, it just kind of looked really weird. If I just let go of it and it stops, that looks unnatural. I guess that's the wrong word, because stopping stuff in time isn't exactly natural. But giving it a bit of delay before it almost learns that it stopped in time helped sell the effect a bit more. So here's one effect we hoped you didn't even notice was an effect. It is the comic books. These are fake. So this being thrown down here, and all of the comics you see throughout are not actually real. We don't own any of these comics. Some of these comics don't even exist. I created the covers for some of these. Well, not from scratch. I took some artwork and stuff. I basically stole some stuff off people. But then, yeah, it's actually some Simpsons comics. Whee! Because for some reason, Kris owns a weird amount of Simpsons comics, and that's the only thing we had available. But we needed a reference for what it would look like to have these things all thrown down there, where the shadows go, how the other comics underneath it would react to having something thrown onto it. And then we painstakingly, because this took a very long time, went through and tracked a cover to it, added some blur, obviously to make it feel real. One of the more tricky bits is obviously as it does hit the table, the rest of the comics underneath move, and so we then also had to track the ones we had already even tracked in the previous shots to this. It's one of those shots that actually the more you look at, the more it looks quite fake. The edges to all of these comics is incredibly hard. It doesn't look real at all, but in the short amount of time you see it, you have no reason to believe it's fake, and it does the job. So go me. Kris is adamant this effect wouldn't work, so that's why I'm really happy this one actually did come out, because it makes him seem like an idiot. So another subtle effect for you here, quite underwhelming one to end on, to be honest. Probably should have put this somewhere in the middle where it's more exciting. But basically, the drink's not actually blue. Oh, crazy. It's actually yellow. In fact, even that one's been changed a bit. Isn't that exciting? Look, I made it orange, and I made this one blue. It's clever, isn't it? And then when we're actually drinking the drinks, obviously we weren't colour correcting it there. We just drank a blue and orange drink we got hold of. But we couldn't find anything to turn a drink blue with a tablet. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this little VFX breakdown. Hope it gave you a little bit of insight into the movie magic behind it all, and give you an appreciation for mediocre effects. So, yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. And we'll see you soon.